Welcome back to True Tolkien, The Rings of Power. This is scroll number 4, in which we will review Amazon's Rings of Power, episode 5, which is entitled Partings. As always, spoiler alert, we will discuss the content of Partings in this scroll, and we will also discuss the lore behind the events in this episode, both of which might give away parts of the episode. So if you haven't seen the episode yet, please be aware there are spoilers inside this video. This scroll may be a little longer than some because there's quite a bit to cover in this episode, as always. And I also am going to take a little time to talk about some trends and some patterns that I'm seeing now after 5 episodes that I'm finding a little disconcerting, and I think they're worth kicking around a little bit. Some of those are just simply related to my deep love for the work of Professor Tolkien. And some of the trends that I see are just very much against the grain, I think, of what J.R.R. Tolkien was about and what his art was about and what his saga of Middle-earth and all the rest of the world that he created was also about. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about that. I'd like to kick off in a little unusual way here and just remind you of why I'm doing this channel and these videos. It's because of that deep love that I have for Tolkien's work and respect for it. And the real feeling that I have that the producers and the writers of the Amazon Rings of Power series are really off base and off track. And they're not taking good care of J.R.R. Tolkien's work. You know, it's an interesting thing. Professor Tolkien spent his life creating Middle-earth and the world that Middle-earth resides in. And he was a real curator of his world. Many of the tales that are in the Silmarillion and, of course, the Lord of the Rings itself and the Hobbit, he wrote and rewrote many times over. He really went back over his work, and some of the stories about that are very interesting. For example, when he first started writing, he wrote on old-style tablets, and they couldn't afford them. It was during, I think World War I even, and they just weren't available. So in many cases, his rewriting, he would literally erase the penciled writing on the tablet and write over the same page again. And his wife, Edith, helped him with typing later, and they just revised and revised and revised again and again and again. And some of the stories, like the Fall of Gondolin, might have been rewritten 10 times to make it closer and closer and closer to perfection. Now, much of the work, especially that's being covered in the series about the Second Age, was not ever finished to Professor Tolkien's standards, and so it was not released while he was alive. But his son Christopher, who was just as dedicated to his father's work as J.R.R. Tolkien was himself, spent his life curating that work, protecting that work, as I've discussed before in these series. And he did release unfinished work because he did not himself dare to finish his father's work. He did not dare to do what the writers and producers of this series are doing, even if he would have stayed much more true to the work because he understood it. So it's difficult to see Professor Tolkien's work not be curated well, not be preserved, not be honored. And so I really want to encourage you to read the Silmarillion, read those works that were released by Christopher Tolkien, the unfinished tales, the Fall of Gondolin. I understand that even more works are being released now. So please get out there, find the Silmarillion and those works, and read them for yourselves so that you have your own vision of what Professor Tolkien's world was about, and you are not relying on what is being shoveled out by Amazon, because it really is very, very off base, not true to the characters, not true to the story, not true to the spirit of the world that Professor Tolkien created. Now, I have talked before about the timeline, and I've talked about some of the resources that you have to look up the information about the Second Age and about the timeline of the Second Age. And so I just want to go over and review some of those sources very quickly. And I've actually, grabbed some of the specific pages that you can find in the texts. And I hope you'll go out and buy those books if you don't already own them. But let's just take a few minutes to actually look at some of that information before we dive in to a review of this week's episode 5. All right, let's start our list of resources for information about the Second Age in one of the best resources, which is the Silmarillion itself. And the Silmarillion is broken down into several different books. The Valaquenta, the story of the beginning of the world, the story of the Valar, and Akalabeth is the story that we want to focus on right now. That is the downfall of Numenor. And the rise and fall of Numenor happens 100% in the Second Age. The Edain, the races of men who assisted the Eldar in their war against Morgoth and who fought and died side by side and had many, many, many tragic stories happen against Morgoth, were gifted with Numenor, the land of the star. And Numenor is a big part, of course, of the episodes so far and will continue to be a big part of it. And their story is told in the Akalabeth. The Edain reach Numenor in the year 30 of the Second Age. And the Second Age, as I mentioned before, lasts 3,400 years. So the story of Numenor is most fully told right here in this book, in the Akalabeth, and that's a great place for a source of information about everything that happened to Numenor. Now, it's not in terribly great detail, which is unfortunate because it's a fantastic story, and it would be awesome if somebody actually made that story. One of the beefs I have with this tale, The Rings of Power, is that even though it's about the Second Age, they're only telling the story in the last 100 years or so, maybe 200, but I doubt it is. More like 100 years, if that, of the Second Age. So all that happened before, the building of Numenor, its greatness, having an understanding of the majesty of the people of Numenor, of their of the pride and the achievements that they have. We're never going to get to see that because they chose not to tell that story. Many of the stories that Tolkien tells are of the rise and fall. And in fact, he says something at the very end of the Silmarillion, at the end of Akalabeth, I believe. If this story has fallen from the great heights to the depths, that was ever the fate of Ardamard. I'm not quoting exactly, but Tolkien's stories are about falls from greatness, but they are falls from greatness. And even in its fall, Numenor was great and continued its story in Middle Earth. All right, so that's number one, the Akalabeth. Now, a second source of information that you have in the Silmarillion is the last book or the last story that it encompasses, which is of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, or of the Third Age and the Rings of Power. You can see it here. And there is a lot of good information about the Second Age in that short work as well, because the Rings of Power were created in the Second Age. And so a lot of good information is to be found there. Now, another source of great information, as I have mentioned before, is to be found in Appendix B of the Return of the King in the Fellowship of the Ring series. The third book is The Return of the King. In Appendix B, you will find the Tale of Years. And the Tale of Years covers the Second Age only briefly, but it does cover very key things in the Second Age. Now, for example, right here on the First Age, you see some very interesting information. There's in year 30, the Numenorians, the Edain, I should say, reach Numenor. That's covered right there. You can see that in year 442, Elros, the first ruler of Numenor, dies. Now, that's Elrond's brother. And he chose to be immortal, but he still was given very long life, as are all of the rulers and highborn of Numenor. And so he probably was possibly as much as 100 to 400 years old before the beginning of the Second Age. So he lived more than 500 years. You can see in the entry right after that, Sauron begins to stir in Middle Earth. So Sauron started to come back after 500 years after the fall of Morgoth. You can see that in year 1000, Sauron starts to become alarmed by the growing power of the elves in Middle Earth and chooses Mordor as his base of operations. And then a little further down, you can see that even later than that, he begins to woo the smiths of Eregion to win them over because he's got the plan for the Rings of Power in mind. And so that is when these troubles started, not at the end of the Second Age. So this is, one of the major beasts that I have with the way they're telling this story by trying to cram it all into the last 100 years of the Second Age. Now, I'll point out just one more thing from the Tale of Years as it relates to the Second Age here, is as you can see that in 1600, the year 1600 of the Second Age, that's when the war begins between Sauron and the elves. And the way that they're portraying it in the series is that Sauron's been missing the entire Second Age and only now is potentially found and coming to light. And that simply is not true. And the problem with skipping over 3,000 years of history is that a lot of things happened during that 3,000 years, like Sauron building up his empire, like Elrond and the elves having a war and having to rebuild from that, like Elrond founding Imladris or Rivendell, as it is known. So, I mean, there's a million things that go on in thousands of years, and you can't just snap your fingers and say, oh, it only took 50 years. Okay, last thing for sure. Here at the top of this page of the Tale of Years, you can see that two great cities, two great fortresses are built, Umbar and Pelargir. And this is a 1,000 years before the end of the Second Age. And who built those? The Numenorians, who have been coming to Middle Earth since the year 600 of the Second Age. Now, in the series, they're portraying it as if the Numenorians have never gone back, have never built the base of power, have never been there. And that is just simply not true. They started going there in year 600. They were tremendous help to the dark men. When I say dark men, I mean the men of darkness who had served Morgoth. They were help to the elves in ending the war with Sauron. And of course, they are the ones responsible for killing Sauron, or at least laying him low at the end of the Second Age. So producers and writers of the series seem to be just kind of skipping all that. Didn't have, we don't need that. We don't need to know about that. So this is why I wanted to make sure you got the source of real information about the Second Age and the world of J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, the last source of information that I'll talk about very, very briefly is simply the Fellowship of the Ring itself. Many events from the Second Age are discussed at great length in the Lord of the Rings, because everything to do with Sauron's downfall that they talk about, how Isildur cut the ring from his finger, how Elendil and Gil-Galad fell, Sam's poem about Gil-Galad. Many events happen, and they just everything about Khazad-dûm, the Balrog and Khazad-dûm. These are things that are discussed and that happen in the Second Age. So the Fellowship of the Ring and even the Hobbit are really important sources of information about the Second Age as well. It is time to talk about this week's episode of Rings of Power, which is again entitled Partings, and we'll talk about the possible meanings of that title towards the end of this scroll. We rejoined the Harfoots this week. We had a break from them last week, and this week we find our Meteor Man and his young sponsor having a nice discussion. He's coming along a little bit with his English, and they can communicate and talk a bit and sit and have a snack. But they have a little conversation about whether he represents peril or whether he is good. And that, of course, is a big question for all of us because we don't know that. We just know that the Meteor Man has some powers because they have a little run in with some wargs. And boy, it's really hard to tell where everybody is because we think that they've been left behind, but then they seem to be rejoining the main group. A little confusion there. But the Meteor Man sends the wargs packing after they have a little chat among themselves with some power. And he slams his hand down and he dispatches the wargs, or at least knocks them down. But the little conversation they have, you could interpret that a couple of different ways. One is, hey, let's get the heck out of here. This guy's going to, do us in. Two is, hey, this guy's one of us. Let's leave him be. And that knife edge, which way does it go, seems to be a bit of a theme here. Later, he is in some pain and he wants to cure his arm. And the thing about this is that I think one of the primary contenders for who he might be is he might be a Balrog, which he absolutely should not be. He could be a one of the Istari, which he absolutely should not be. He could be something completely new, which he absolutely should not be. But when he turns the water into ice to help his pain, that is a little bit of a clue that he may not be a Balrog, because Balrogs are creatures of fire, and I don't know that they could handle water and ice spells. But who knows? It's not impossible. Now, there's one more very strange thing that happens related to Meteor Man, which is that camera suddenly cuts to the Meteor Man crash site by Meteor Delivery Service, and there are three very strange looking creatures there. Women, I am going to say they are. They have robes on. They kind of look elvish, but they're not elvish. One of them's pretty wicked looking. And this is mysterious because in Tolkien's world, there were very few female magical or sorceress type creatures. And there's absolutely no clue that Sauron ever used them. So who they are, hard to say. But that's another thing that's been thrown into the mix. Aside from being the host of the Meteor Man, I don't really know what role the Harfoots have to play in this entire story. And I'm worried about the role they have to play because I don't think they would want to introduce another generation of Harfoots, which means they'd be trying to stick everything within one generation. But I have a theory on the role the Harfoots might have to play that I sincerely doubt that the producers have even thought of, or the writers. And I'll trot that out in a future episode. Next, we have a brief but interesting encounter with Adar. Adar is hanging out with one of his orcs, and he asked the orc to see his arm so he could check the progress and the pain level of his whatever disease he's got running among men and beasts. And he makes an interesting comment. And the comment that he makes that's interesting is that, oh, I envy you, so assumedly the pain. I envy you your pain because I soon will no longer be able to experience it and I will miss it. Now, if this is Sauron, then he may be foretelling the fact that he is going to fall. And when he falls, he loses his corporal body. He loses his physicality, and he becomes the Eye of Sauron, as you recall from Lord of the Rings. That's an argument that Adar may be Sauron. But here's an argument that Adar may not be Sauron. Sauron does not allow his name to be spelt or spoken. And Sauron, this Adar guy is several times by the end of this episode called Sauron, and does not really do anything super violent about it or anything like that. So that's a micro argument for why he might not be Sauron. So we pick up the story of the men people and the elf, the single elf that's in the watchtower now. And of course, Adar has had the encounter with the elf where he sent them to inform the men that he's going to kill them all unless they serve him. And so we now have this scene where the elf's love interest lady is going to take on the mantle of leadership, and she has a scene very, very reminiscent of the scene that the queen has in the courtyard in Numenor, which made no sense whatsoever, of who's with me. And you get the usual, reluctant few hands, then people raise their hands, and then you get the guy who is going to throw a monkey wrench in the works and say, hey, we want to live. And you could say one thing about our ancestors: they served Morgoth, but they lived. So, I have a real objection to this whole thing because it's been 3,000 years and men don't have lives that are that long. And Morgoth's been gone for a long time. And so Sauron has supposedly been missing. And so why are they interested in going back to that? But they are. And sure enough, we later see that this guy who leads the mob away to serve Sauron gets to pay with blood for the privilege of serving Sauron. We also see a scene between the elf and the kid who discovered Sauron's knife, and they make more out of the knife, with finding something that apparently has been hidden in plain sight for generations, which is a big knife in the cliff or whatever the heck it is. None of this ever existed, but it's just it's a story mechanism that they've got going. But there's an interesting conversation between the elf and the kid. Now, I've got a total objection to the elves being in this role at all in the first place. They've been set up as the protectors of the men that are left in Middle Earth, and they really did not take on that role. And they certainly did not take on the role of the police. And what the kid says to the elf basically is, oh yeah, you guys were here making sure our knives weren't too sharp and questioning everything we did. So the elves were not only quote unquote protectors and police, but they literally were spies and controllers of the men that were left there. And that simply didn't happen. The elves did not really want anything to do with men and had very little to do with them, especially the men that were left in Middle Earth and who had a very, very hard time. So that whole thing just makes no sense whatsoever. They did not militarily control or look over men that were in Middle Earth at all. We don't really see much progress on this front. However, it is looking to me, since these people and the kid has this knife, which Galadriel would want, that as it will later tie into the Numenorians coming back to Middle Earth, I suspect that these people are going to be besieged in this tower and are probably going to be rescued somehow by the people coming from Numenor. So we'll see what happens with that. The Numenorian storyline in this episode centers primarily on two significant things. One is, unfortunately, Isildur. Isildur as the young pup screw-up. And I find this part of the story very unfortunate because, of course, Isildur in the Second Age and in the Lord of the Rings is the father of Aragorn's line, and he is never presented as a teenager by Tolkien. He is presented as a young man, but a very brave, mature young man who is a captain of a Numenorian vessels and does a very, very brave thing that we'll talk about a little bit later. But here he's presented as someone who'll do anything, even though he just finished screwing up and not even getting into the sailor service at all for Numenor. He'll now do anything to get in the expedition to Middle Earth. And that includes wheedling his father, asking his father to put him at the front of the line, trying to get his friends to help, saying, you can hit me 3 times. I mean, it's just really unfortunate. And doesn't make for a good part of the show in any case. The second storyline from Numenor in this week's episode is they're preparing to go to Middle Earth. And Galadriel is trying to talk Halbrand into actually going, giving information that's needed, and putting himself forward as this supposed king that never existed in the Tolkien story, putting himself forward to lead or be part of this expedition. She has made commitments to the queen. And in one scene, the queen all but calls her out for not being truthful. And that's a theme we'll talk about a bit later in this episode, in this scroll, because it's really, again, not in keeping at all. And the entire Halbrand story is just not real. And the way it's been put together is really unfortunate. Speaking of unfortunate, another little incident that happens that is, not at all consistent with the personality or the character of Galadriel is this street scenario where she comes upon this group of young cadets that are doing some sword training, and she jumps in to train them, and she says, "If any of you can even touch me, I'll be surprised." And then Elendil jumps in and says, "I'll add to that if you can draw blood, you're going to be a lieutenant." So here's this bunch of scrubs, and he's going to make one of them a lieutenant if he can cut Galadriel in a fight. Well, so Galadriel does the usual thing of showing off, but the last thing you want to do is actually get cut, which she does. So it's again just one of these things that's not in keeping with the character. And now we have a guy that just barely got into the service as a commander in the Numenorian Navy, and it just brings Numenor down, because Numenor would never have done that. They would never have had anyone in their military become a lieutenant under such circumstances, and here we go. Queen Muriel also has a conversation with her father, Tar-Palantir, who's near death, and Tar-Palantir warns her not to go to Middle-earth. Well, he shouldn't have to warn her not to go to Middle-earth. She never did go to Middle-earth. I think that this just adds to the confusion of who's doing what, why are they doing it. But they're sending 5 ships to Middle-earth from Numenor, 500 men, supposedly, and that's what's going on. But the conclusion of the Isildur story, or part of the Isildur story presented here, is that he decides, because he can't talk anybody into letting him actually go on the expedition, because he hasn't earned the right to do so, he decides he's going to stow away on the boats. Well, he happens to go to the boat and is in the process of stowing away when someone, just a passerby, jumps on the boats and is going to burn the ships. So the Numenorian security is apparently not very good, but Isildur struggles with this guy, and he does, in fact, manage to burn 2 of the ships, because Isildur maybe stops him from burning them all, but can't stop him from burning 2. So this then becomes Isildur's ticket to be able to go on the expedition. At the end of the Numenorian part of the tale here, we see that Isildur, yes, he's in uniform, and yes, he's on the ship going on the expedition, but he will end up being the scullery cook or tending the animals or something like that, lowest of the low. And again, this is just not in keeping with the character and the story of Isildur at all. So they're heading to Middle Earth with only 3 ships, but Elendil and his sons are in the expedition, and Isildur has done this kind of good, brave thing to save a couple of the ships. And I'm quite concerned that this is a replacement for the actual story of Isildur that we'll talk about later. But bookmark this spot, because this may be the one and only trip of Numenorians to Middle Earth that they plan to present, and that would be an incredible, just an incredible blow up of the actual story. But here at the end, we see that Galadriel's made up with Halbrand, and they're on the same team heading to Middle Earth. And again, my guess is to go save the people that are in the fortress. We'll see how that works out. The last part of this week's review, we'll move to the dwarves and the elves and see what they're up to this week, which is quite a lot. And they start out with a meeting that has been coming with Durin. And basically, the meeting is a bit of a joust of, who's being more dishonest, and what are the real motivations that everybody has for their actions. And Durin's there, of course, on a mission from his father to find out what's going on. And in the middle of the meeting, Durin lays his hand on the table and says, well, if you people are so honest, then why are you using this special stone that our people only use for burials? And basically, Gil-Galad, the king, stops him in his tracks and he says, well, we'll have to return this stone to you immediately. And, Durin assents to that. And so, this kind of interesting interplay takes place between the elves and the dwarves at this little dinner that they're having on this sacred stone table. After the dinner meeting with Durin, the king, Gil-Galad, has a more serious meeting with Elrond and asks him why he has not succeeded in the mission to find out what the dwarves are up to in Khazad-dûm. And even though Elrond tells the king that he has sworn an oath to Durin not to reveal what they're up to, which of course means he does know what they're up to, the king does not relent and really presses Elrond to reveal the secret. And he ends up telling Elrond this story of how Mithril was created, because the king suspects that the dwarves have Mithril. And he expresses this story of a big fight between an elf and a Balrog over a special tree, and somehow the roots of the tree put mithril into the ground, and with its pure light, absolute pure. And this is all a bunch of BS. This is not anything from the Tolkien fiction, from the legends, or any other source of information related to Arda, the Middle Earth. And so the producers and the writers are, again, just making stuff up because there's not enough for them to work with, apparently, in Tolkien's massive world. They have to make stuff up. And the king, does not relent, and he presses Elrond to reveal the secret. And Elrond refuses. Elrond then has a meeting with Celebrimbor. Now, Celebrimbor is the grandson of Fëanor. And Fëanor is the mightiest of all elves who created the Silmarils. And Celebrimbor, most of any of his siblings or cousins or even his uncles, has the gifts of Fëanor in working of metal and jewels, and he has a lot of ambition. But Celebrimbor reveals to Fëanor the real interest in Mithril. And he tells Elrond, I'm sorry, I didn't want to lie to you. The king made me in sending you to Khazad-dûm. But he reveals to Elrond that Mithril is absolutely needed because the elves are all dying and will lose their lives over the long term unless they have Mithril, because the pure light of Mithril can restore the elves. And this is 100% bullshit and wins our Outrage of the Week award for this week's episode of Rings of Power, because this is a huge and ridiculous departure from anything that Tolkien wrote or thought about. And it really makes me mad that the producers and the writers can't come up, if they were going to make up a story, come up with something better. The lives of the Eldar, the lives of the elves, are tied to the life of Arda. They will be on Earth unless they're killed by accident or mischance. They'll be on Earth forever. And they will wane, and they know they are waning. And because they are the elder race, and the new races of men are coming up, and their time has passed, and they will go to Valinor and live out their eternal life there. But it isn't because they're sick and they need mithril to cure them. That has nothing to do with anything. And you know what I can just see them doing right now? Remember the mithril coat of Bilbo's that Frodo wears? They're gonna say that that was created to wrap the elven children in so that their lives could be restored. I can't even imagine where they're going to go with this. But all of this amounts to a massive amount of pressure that's put on Elrond to get the mithril from the dwarves. After the meetings with Gil-Galad and Celebrimbor, Elrond accompanies Durin back to Khazad-dûm. And you'll notice the elves walking with the table that Durin lied to them about. Because, yes, Elrond confronts Durin and says, "You lied about that, right?" And he said, "Yep, I sure did." And Elrond then tells Durin about the problem that the elves had and their need for the mithril. And Durin says, "Well, we'll have to talk to my father." Now, all of this may be some attempt by the producers and the writers to explain why were the dwarves and the elves so close in this relationship, because other than that, they weren't really that close in any other context. But they don't need an explanation for that. The dwarves were smiths, and Celebrimbor was the greatest smith of the elves since Fëanor. They had that relationship. They had that closeness. The elves created art and door work for the dwarves, and the dwarves did a lot of work for the elves and helping them build their cities. They just had a good relationship. You don't have to go beyond that to explain it. And this whole mithril thing, this is just an outrage, and that's why it's the outrage of the week. Well, that's our scroll for this week. I had intended to do a bit of a recap of some of the trends that I see in the show, but this episode is now so long that I am going to do a separate episode for a mid-season recap and talk about some of those trends and some of the troubling things that I see. And one thing I want to make clear, if you have not read the Silmarillion, and some of the other works, and you're enjoying the show, you're enjoying Amazon's program, I am not trying to get you to not enjoy it, but I am trying to encourage you. If you are enjoying it, you are really going to love the actual story that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote. And so I, again, encourage you, get the Silmarillion, get into it. You'll love it. Absolutely. So watch for that mid-season recap show. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time on True Tolkien, The Rings of Power.